afternoon's meeting, which is on from uneven and combined development to permanent revolution. We have Neil Davidson here on my right, who's going to speak for about 40 minutes. He's the chair of the Livingston branch of the Scottish Socialist Party. He's also on the executive of the Scottish PCS and the author of two books, The Origins of Scottish Nationhood and Discovering the Scottish Revolution, for which he won the Isaac Deutsche Memorial Prize a couple of years ago. So as I said, he's going to speak for about 40 minutes, and after that there'll be plenty of time for people to ask questions, to take up any disagreements they have with the speaker, or to add any points of their own, and then he will come back at the end to sum up the discussion. So without further ado, that's it.
The original title, can everyone hear that okay? Yeah. The original title of the meeting was actually Violating the Laws of History. I should explain a bit about that. In October 1917, when the Russian Revolution had just taken place, the message was put on to George Volkanov, at that point a very right-wing member of the Menshevik Party and an opponent of the Bolsheviks. And it was told, this revolution has taken place. And he said, they can't. It's violating the laws of history. Now, I don't know if this story is actually true or not, although it should be, because it's the kind of story that should be true. But certainly that is the theme I'm coming at here. What I'm going to talk about largely is uneven and combined development. There is a meeting later on this week about permanent revolution that Tony Phillips is doing, and I guess I'll take up a lot of the specific issues at the back, but I'm going to talk about there's uneven combined development. I think I want to start, so this is buzzing, is it? You're getting feedback. Yeah. Is that, can you still hear that? Yeah. That's it, okay. I want to go back then 100 years, almost exactly, to 1905, because that year saw the first Russian Revolution. And that really was the first of a series of revolutions in what we now call, or used to call, the Third World. Russia, Turkey, then Persia, China, and Mexico. And Lenin called this the awakening of the East, or obviously also called Latin America. And that really was the signal that the peoples of those worlds had decided they weren't simply going to be the objects of history, they were going to be the subjects of it as well. 100 years later, after most of the colonial empires are gone, with the exception of things like occupied Palestine, obviously, and imperialism in that form no longer exists, can we still speak about the Third World as a kind of unity in that kind of way? And there's two quite strong arguments for suggesting that we shouldn't. We should stop talking about the backward countries and that kind of thing at all. One is simply because the countries we used to talk about as being the underdeveloped world or the Third World are now so different from each other. To talk about them as if they all belong to the same kind of spectrum is really pushing things beyond what one term would be. And obviously, think about the giants, India, China, Indonesia, and compare them to Burkina Faso, or failed states like Haiti, or increasingly Sudan, places like Congo, where the state is broken down and essentially society is reverting to war of all against all. It's difficult to see how they could be essentially compared in the same any kind of sensible way. And there's a second argument, which is a more political one, that comes from the left and from the anti-globalization movement, which is that, look, do we want to divide up the world in this way? We are all one world. We're all fighting the same menace of capitalist globalization. Do we actually want to start talking about different bits of the world in that way? And of course, you can see the point of that. I mean, think of the great demonstration in London in February last year and the impact that had in Cairo and led to those people feeling inspiration to demonstrate themselves. And essentially, you can see that kind of logic in that. Why do we want to divide the world up in that way? However, I think there is still a necessity to talk about the world in these divisions and the world outside the core elements of the system in Western Europe, North America, Australia, and Japan. And there's other bits of the world which very few other sections have joined that core. And I think there are essentially four reasons. One is because those countries still suffer from enormous poverty that is not just relative but absolute. It's not even poor people in the West eat rubbish food, but poor people in the Third World who don't eat at all. There is a whole bit of difference in that. Secondly, you have very repressive states in which the question of democracy is still a major issue in a way that isn't in the West, formal democracy, in a way that isn't in the West. States are repressive internally and often prone to external adventures, and Iraq is obviously a classic example of that pre-invasion. Thirdly, you're talking about a situation where states are still under the domination of the great imperialist states. Whatever the relationship precisely is, and again, Iraq is a good example of a state which has shifted between support and opposition from they are still in that relationship of subordination to it. And fourth and finally, although the working class is growing in most of these areas, it's still a minority of the population. Even in China, which is one of the biggest working classes among India and Indonesia, 70% of the population are still peasants. So we have to think that still a minority in that part of the world, although the world as a whole is becoming a majority. So what is the solution then for the backwardness, the poverty, the oppressive state, and all the rest of it? Well, there are two opposing extremes, if you like. On the one hand, the kind of supporters of the system, of the neoliberal consensus, say, like, what you've got to do, it's quite simple. You've got to accept the neoliberal agenda, privatisation, deregulation, doing away with subsidies and so on, in economics, and politically you've got to adopt bourgeois democracy, representative democracy, as they call it. And that's one argument. And of course that can be opposed to the power of a gun if necessary, which I'll also see that in various arguments. So the extreme from that is a kind of left position which does away with any idea of achieving development at all, which simply says what we should do is defend the indigenous peoples who are being oppressed by loggers and so on, and that's a model for us to follow. Essentially we should do away with the ideas of developing and leave things as they are. That's a very, whatever virtues there are in the conservative movement, that's a position which essentially is a way of taking power. And if you read some of the Western theorists of this position, John Holloway and people like that, they explicitly say that this is just a means of defending ourselves. I think there is an alternative theory which I think is connected with Trotsky's writings, which means we don't have to accept what the only alternatives are either neoliberalism and so on, or a sort of defensive retreat, simply protecting what's already there, it's already been eroded by the time. I think that an even combined development provides us with an alternative to that. Now, as I say, I'm going to concentrate on that rather than revolution that's been discussed elsewhere. But one thing I think you have to look at first is why is uneven and combined development so little discussed at all? Because I know of about 5 articles that have discussed it since Trotsky died. One of them has been published yet, will probably be next year. And that's across the whole of Trotsky's movement, Stalin's movement, academic studies and so on. There's hardly anything discussing it. People talk about permanent revolution all the time. There's been massive controversies about permanent revolution. But this theory of an even combined development, without which permanent revolution couldn't happen, couldn't exist, is simply passed over, usually in a couple of sentences. Even by people in the international socialist tradition. I'll cite examples if you want, examples of this. But this is, it's kind of this underlying theory, this bypass. I think we have to focus on it slightly more. The reasons why I think are many and various. One is that Trotsky himself never coined the phrase uneven combined development until 1932 in his history of the Russian Revolution, although the idea is present in his earlier writings. But he didn't, he gathered together everything he wrote about it. It comes to 10 pages. It's not very much, although it's extremely important. Secondly, I think the Trotskyist movement has been reluctant to discuss it, partly because it's always been more pressing to discuss the political implications of the permanent revolution, but also, I think, because there are all sorts of uncomfortable connotations for orthodox Trotskyists, particularly in the theory of an even combined development, as for example. Thirdly, I think that there has also been a marked reluctance of the academic community, I suppose we call them, to engage with Trotsky. Trotsky is regarded as being a bit vulgar, unlike Althusser or Coletti or somebody like Gramsci, even who can spend pages blathering on about it. Trotsky does actually imply some sort of commitment to practice in the end, and therefore to do something, and therefore that's not considered appropriate, and so he doesn't tend to get discussed. And the problem with that is because there aren't huge rows about Trotskyism in the academy, or very many, the need to defend the theory and extend it doesn't really come up. So I think it hasn't really been discussed, and what I hope in the future book is to actually deal with that. To understand the significance of the breakthrough that Trotsky made intellectually with this theory, I thought it came before it, and the idea of stages of development he was rebelling against, which means we have to go back, I suppose, briefly to the Enlightenment. It's important to understand that theories of development, of progress, are actually relatively recent in human history. Most of the time, before about the 16th century, people thought of human society as being either degenerative from some sort of previous perfect state, or cyclical, things just going round and round, or even static, essentially the Christian notion, between the fall and the end of the days, nothing very important happens until you die, and then you're judged what you've done. Essentially, it doesn't see progress being there at all. That began to break down at the time of the Renaissance, partly because of the discovery of America and of peoples who are obviously in different stages of development when people found them, partly due to scientific revolution, which in itself was propelled by the need for navigation and so on, which obviously meant that we knew more things than the ancients did. Moderns were aware of more things and helped progress. So the notion of progress began to develop. It only really appeared in the Enlightenment, and particularly the invention of the French, and I should say here the Scots, and the lead in this of developing a notion of stages of development, the so-called 4-stage theory. It was originally 3 stages under the French, and this is no accident, as we say. You start with hunting, gathering, you move to pasturage, because of keeping animals, and thirdly you have agriculture. The Scots are at the 4th, which is commerce, commercial society. The ultimate goal of everyone was to get to the point of commercial society. It's not exactly the same as capitalism, I should point out. Nevertheless, there are obviously affinities here. And I should say that they saw this as being a universal goal, something that's open to everybody. The Enlightenment comes into a lot of stick these days, but I think it's important to understand they saw this as being something which everyone could achieve, even the people who were backward at the time this was being written about in the 18th century. In the following century, Walter Paget said that Adam Smith's goal was to show how a savage could become a Scotsman to rise to the absolute pinnacle of human achievement, which is living in Edinburgh circa 1780. Of course, it still is true, of course. But the point, joking apart, the point is that this was not a Eurocentric position which saw everyone as inferior to Europe, they saw everyone as being able to go through this process. Now, that didn't last, obviously, with the rise of racist ideology, which you can see already actually in some of Hegel's writings. But nevertheless, it was originally a universalist doctrine. Societies would develop through the expansion of trade, and as trade developed, the division of labour would increase, and you'd get to the point where commercial society would dominate. We'd all been there, but it would become dominant, that's what you had to get to. Now, Marx and Engels took over some of this, but their views are slightly different. For one thing, the Enlightened people talked about modes of subsistence. That was all these things are described well, and so on, are means of man interacting with nature, producing what they need. They didn't talk about class relations in that. Marx brought that in. So instead of talking about modes of subsistence, they talked about modes of production. That's crucial to think, but it is different from the Enlightened view. The most important thing, however, was that they broke away from the notion that there was some universal series that everyone had to go through at the same stage of things. One thing that the Scots and Friends did say was everyone starts off at the same place and they go along the same road. The Marx and Engels don't say this, and it's one of the great bourgeois and Stalinist myths that they did. Isn't the case that they say, right, primitive communism, then you go to the Asiatic mode, then you go to slavery, then you go to feudalism, then you go to, and so on. That is not what Marx and Engels are saying. Essentially, they're saying, you go primitive communism, you then move into some or various forms of pre-capitalist society, then there's a universal transition to capitalism possible, and then possibly a move to socialism, depending on what actually happens in terms of the class struggle. But you have to get to capitalism. That isn't a series of universal stages. They rejected this for two quite sensible reasons. One was that even in the middle of the 19th century, when it began to form the developed in 1948, it was obvious that even countries that were still feudal, still absolutist, had some capitalist development, and that meant working class. So even at this point, the bourgeoisie, who should be the revolutionary class taking forward society and so on, began to get cold feet, began to look at the revolution as a problem, because it would involve the working class fighting for their own demands, potentially anyway, within that revolutionary process. So you couldn't simply develop in the way things had happened at, say, the time of the French Revolution or further back, the English Revolution. So they understood there had to be a change there. The working class would have to fight for its own, it would have to do the tasks, in the sense of the bourgeoisie for it, and it would have to maintain its own independence while it was doing that. And once you had achieved the state and possibility of capitalist development, holding and so on, the working class would then have to fight for its own demands within that. This is what they describe ultimately as permanent revolution. Their time, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with Trotsky's notion, and because that on a world scale was not possible in 1848, or indeed for many decades after that. So I mean, Marx was an many things, and it wouldn't have suggested you could build socialism in 3 countries in Western Europe, and of course the rest of the world was still mired in feudalism or even feudal forms. So that was one thing they saw you couldn't simply develop from the old model. The second thing was, it was fairly obvious, again, because they were stupid, that India, for example, was not going to develop in the same way as Britain did, because Britain had conquered it. That meant that it simply had to have a different pattern of development. Now, the attitude Marx and Engels took towards India, for example, was actually quite complicated. I would say it was conflicted, but it's like, well, I would say that. It's not a dialectical position. It said, on one hand, the British are breaking down the old barriers to production. They are advancing things, bringing about the possibility of working class. But on the other hand, this is the most monstrous sort of destruction of native societies, the most horrendous oppression, and so on. Now, actually, they were incredibly wrong about the idea that Britain was developing the Indian economy in the sense of state meant. But nevertheless, I think the point is nevertheless right, and understands the tragedy of progress at this point. However, later on in their careers, they did actually change things slightly and saw that it was possible, there would have to be a revolution in the West if you were going to speed up the development of what we call China. It would also be possible, here we're looking for Russia particularly, that a revolution there, a revolution still to establish capitalism, peasant votes and so on, would stimulate a revolution in the West. So there's a possible flow either way. They left the question open. It wasn't something that they closed off by the time they died. Although they certainly never believed it was possible for Russia, for example, to advance to socialism. Second International, the movement of, in most cases, Marxist parties, are always from 1889, took over to a large extent codified what Marx and Engels had said, and made it a much more rigid system with a much greater emphasis on development. Equally, a phrase of Marx's, no social order is ever destroyed for all productive forces which should have been developed, and new and superior relations of production never replace older ones for the material conditions of producing. That was taken very seriously by International, and turned into an idea that each individual country had to go through the set of stages. kind of caricature of second international thought, which makes them all a bunch of dull plodders. They're all thinking of the theory of stages and nobody ever got beyond that. This isn't true. And a lot of people, particularly Karl Kautsky actually in the early days, did actually have some quite inventive thought, and a particularly important essay called The American Worker, which Kautsky wrote in 1905, which was only published in English last year on historical materialism, and I urge people to get this up. Extremely important article, very influential on Trotsky. And in fact, it's the only article that Trotsky actually quotes from another Marxist in Results and Prospects. It's extremely important article. Which Kautsky says, well, look, you've got America, the most advanced capitalist country, with the weakest working class, and you've got Russia, the most backward capitalist country, with the strongest, most militant working class. How can this be? In any kind of simple set of progression, that would be the case. America, when it comes to the developing class, Russia, the most backward one. But that isn't the case. You've got to look at it as a historical process, not a set of political categories. I mean, Kautsky obviously repeated these positions later on, but I think it's important statements to make it fixed at the time. Similarly, other people, Rudolf Hilferding, Finance Capital, and a man called Antonio Labriola, and the Italian Marxists at the time, began to look beyond the simple stages theory, and these things are all influential on Trotsky himself. But before we got to the Trotsky's own theory, what did arise, which did in a sense break with stages, was the simple theory of underdevelopment. Now this really has two elements to it. One, and it's something that a number of people particularly noticed, was that countries which are beginning to industrialise late, that's towards the end of the 19th century, don't start at the point at which Britain started at 300 years ago. They actually go right to the most advanced point, with the most advanced machinery, the most advanced social relations, and so on, and start from there. They don't go through the whole history again. Now this is important, this is uneven development. People often confuse this with uneven development. This is a point loads of people were making before 1905. And actually noticing, I mean, you had to notice this, Japan, Russia, these are countries which had been backward, had been absolutely rushing forward and taking over from Britain at the forefront of capitalist development. So it's one aspect of uneven development, as it was solidified by Lenin during the First World War, primarily the imperialism of our time. On the one hand, there's competition between the great powers, the great capitalist powers themselves, which leads them to try to lead each other in economic development, but also to engage in wars with each other. So there's inter-capitalist competition between the great powers. And the second aspect of it, of course, is the power exercised by the great powers over the colonies, over the colonial, semi-colonial areas. They divide them into the actual colonies, like India and so on, and those countries which are just tied in, like Argentina, for example, to the system. So that theory was very important breakthrough at the time. So it said, well, fairly obviously, why some countries couldn't just go down the old road of development, but also explain why there were some weaknesses in the system in these colonial areas earlier than perhaps in the heart of the system. After the Russian Revolution, I'm going to look ahead for a bit. After the Russian Revolution was defeated, Stalinism consolidated, the theory of uneven development became one of the major underpinnings of Stalinism. And the idea that there was no development possible in the Third World, or hardly any economic development possible there. But what you could do was break out of the system altogether, through a revolution by the Communist Party, break out of the system, and then all of a sudden you could develop in a new fabulous socialist way, which wouldn't actually involve being tied into the system at all. Now, you may see a kind of contradiction here. On the one hand, development is impossible under capitalism, that means people are very backward, but once you've had the revolutionary process, they can then develop, and so without any problems. And that was a major problem and difficulty, and of course was done between the Stalin propagated from 1924 onwards. Now, it's against that, and it's also against, I suppose, the sort of renewed Second International notion of stages, which arose until we do have the First Revolution, that Trotsky's theory has to be seen in this context, and the breakthrough that represented has to be discussed. Now, he wrote the theory and developed it in two stages. The initial, around 1905, 1906, time of the First Russian Revolution, where it's kind of buried beneath the notion of revolution. And then a second stage, where he's fighting against Stalin in 1920, his theory of the country, but also against what that implies in China. And China is a particularly important example here. Trotsky was appalled at the start, eventually, actually didn't know this, eventually he didn't realise what was going on. He was appalled at the strategy being pursued, which Stalin set out with his usual inimitable style. I won't actually read the stuff, because he'll fall asleep, but he just go through, start the Democratic Alliance, and we must move on to national liberty, and you've got to go through all this, and then you have economic development and so on. And it's like, this I think spiraled Trotsky, not only to define the theory of economic revolution itself, but also the underpinning into development and name the theory of uneven development. So I'm going to treat them as one, essentially, the elements of those discussions. First of all, we obviously draws on Kautsky, he draws on Goldfarb, he draws on Lenin, but he brings something that we he starts on uneven development. This is what he starts on uneven development. People often quote bits on the history of the Russian Revolution and talk about how we're working here. But mostly what they quote is a bit about the American colonists arriving in America. They don't just start with everything new, they pick up. That's uneven development. Where the Native Americans pick up guns and use it to shoot the colonists, that's combined development. Because that's a backward formation, a bronze or Estonian even, kind of development using modern technology. So, he starts on the question of uneven development, then moves on. And I think there are particularly 5 important aspects of combined aspects of it. One is the world economy. For the world economy, for Trotsky, it's not just the sum total of the different national economies. It is the fact that these are linked together in a million different ways, through trade, through production, through finance, and crucially through war. He makes the point, First World War, Russia, First World War imposes the same demands on everyone, regardless of the level of development you lack, which means you've got to develop your industry, you've got to develop your weaponry, you've got to, in order to participate in the imperialist struggle, regardless of how lack developed you are. So the system itself produces, draws people into a single set of demands, which they have to meet, no matter which stage they are down the road. And what you get is what we call competitive emulation. And for people who are strong enough to do this, Russia has to try and compete with Germany, Britain, and so on. At the same time, imposing itself on imperial power in China and India. And in some cases, you will get imperial powers deliberately refusing to develop economies. Britain did in Iraq after World War I, for example, deliberately reintroduced semi-feudal relationships which had been decaying for decades beforehand, and brought them back to maintain the power of local sultans and so on. The only area where capital development was taking place was, of course, in the oil industry, where the needed to start to stuff on that was flowing. The world economy is the first thing. It's not the case that each individual island, each country's island, which is separate from everything else. They're totally connected. Which means, for Trotsky, not just a revolution in, say, India would have to be joined by other revolutions, or else it would be lost. A revolution in Britain would have to be joined by other revolutions, or it would be lost as well. It's not just currently, you have what he constantly refers to as the new formations appearing. For God's sake, you say it's dominated by feudalism. It isn't dominated by feudalism. Capitalism is actually the most important new form of economy there in the towns. And even in the countryside, where semi-feudal relations still exist, they're not the old feudal relations. They're totally new kind of formations which have been created by the links with the capitalist economy. It's not as if it was the 16th century or something, that everything seems to look back there. The inclusion of capitalist relations affects everything else. Now, this is extremely important because if there are two major theories, social science, about development, one is the idea of the dual economy, where you've got traditional, pre-modern peasants wandering around here somewhere, then you've got the modern capitalist. You see, that isn't the case. You can't just keep one sector isolated from the other. It's going to be affected. We're bringing in all sorts of new ideas, new stuff. New ideas is secret, which is where you've got this wonderful structure of old and new in a way that's going to that's the case, following an explosive, full of tension, full of revolutionary potential. And the reason for that is development is through the intensity of urbanisation and industrialisation, where people are plopped at enormous speed, peasant or artisanal or rural background, thrown into factories, thrown into modern cities. All that implies changes to consciousness, or changes to ideas which they can have, for their relation to the world, their exposure to modernity, to electricity, to speed. Not as in England, where this took hundreds of years to take place, but in decades, or even less than decades, the new cities that grew up or grew up, people are plunged into them, inevitably think totally different thoughts. It's a very interesting passage, a great book by a man called Colin. This is the 1940s. It's a great example of this. The impact of the Marxist theory, particularly when minds that lived on ancient ideas that assume that poverty and wealth are something fated and alterable features of life, can be imagined. An Iraqi of a religious family who'd been brought up according to traditional Shiite precepts, and to be a member of the Politburo of the Communist Party in the 40s, recalled in a conversation with this writer that when reading a forbidden book, he first came across the idea that distinctions between men were not God-given, but due to human historical causes. The idea came to him as a revelation. He said, this is the idea that people are something plunged into new situations with access to human beings, and also things possible. That's the third thing. The fourth is that this takes place in a context characterised by political repression. People are experiencing horrible working conditions, incredible bad housing conditions. They have no way of fighting back against it because the state is oppressive, it's anarchic, it doesn't allow democratic representation. What do? You have to organise, you have to set up underground organisations, you begin to think about the law, you begin to think about the way society is organized in a totally different way, because in a sense you can't, your conditions are terrible and you to actually go to the most advanced, just as industry goes to the most advanced points of production, the most advanced forms of production, people's ideology can go to the most advanced forms of thought. The example from Marx there is one, and it's why Trotsky said in Russia, Marxism was the firmest hold, revolutionary Marxism was the firmest hold in Petrograd and the cities of the industrialized West. They were doing it in China in the early part of the 90s because of this experience of letting people go through this. To me, is not like one of those academic gatekeepers of capitalism and else nothing to do with that. What Trotsky's trying to do is explain how certain forms of organisation, certain forms of thought can arise from the brutal smashing together of different forms of society, different stages of society. And that then is sort of evolution. Because if you have all that, there's a working class, small overall in the country, but militant, agitated, at the centre of the industry, even if the bourgeoisie is incapable of demanding democratic demands without its sphere, its links, considering all, you can still actually come to power, and start pushing forward. Socialism is only possible because of the very first point you mentioned, the creation of the world economy. If it doesn't spread, it's revolution. We do. Now, in other words, it's possible to talk about social revolution in backward countries because of a given combined development. That's why it's getting revolution as a strategy, which is possible because of these developments. But that means two things. First of all, it means it's possible to talk about revolution in the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, or early 19th centuries because the possibility of a world economy can exist. Of course, there were workers in medieval villages or last during the French Revolution, but they could not have pushed the revolution at that point because there was no possibility of socialism on any global or international basis. So that is, I think, we have to write this out. Also, I think, maybe more controversial, I think that we have to say the term revolution doesn't occur just where there's some deviation from bourgeois norms of democracy. We don't talk about the term revolution in Britain, monarchy. We don't talk about the revolution in some country in Latin America just happens to have a dictatorship for a couple of years. So these are epochal things we're talking about, not those minor changes to the level of the state. We also live under it, but I mean, that isn't the point. There is a certain tendency, I think, because Stalinists are always talking about alliances, bourgeoisie and progressive, start saying, no, the answer is permanent revolution. Well, it is in some cases where there's a need for combined development, isn't it all? The answer is just no, the answer is social revolution and working class. We don't have to invoke permanent revolution every single situation where there is a question of alliance. So there are some weaknesses in Trotsky's theory, and I guess we brought it like Tony on Thursday, one of the clips particularly identified, which is that it's all very well to talk about a revolutionary working class, but suppose there isn't one. Suppose the working class is a regulatory, has developed in basis of industry and so on, and for one reason or another, it's not revolutionary. Suppose the ruling class would be crafty and had bought it off with Lawrence corrupted, who also not. If you've got that, then you won't have a revolutionary working class. If you haven't got a revolutionary working class, you won't have the final ingredient, I suppose, which is the revolutionary party, to actually advocate the strategy of revolution in the first place. That's a problem. And the second problem, slightly developed, I think, is possibly Trotsky's. There aren't any tasks of the revolution. Trotsky's model is very much derived from the French Revolution. The trouble is, of course, that the French Revolution is a great exception. It's actually an extraordinarily weird event in world history, which is no exact parallel anyway with it. And most of those revolutions are like that. Most of those revolutions are actually top-down affairs introduced quite often by old ruling classes who have seen the way the wind's going, understood the game's up, unless they actually develop and transform their countries along the lines of those that already made it to capitalist development. The Russian Junkers, the Japanese samurai, the sort of noble Middle Age and the Risorgimento, the Scottish nobles during the period of 1746 and so on, were all not bourgeois elements, they were actually elements you saw that capitalism had introduced and they have to do with the bourgeoisie if necessary. Now, Marx, interestingly, did notice this, and particularly Engels noticed this, and wrote very, very brilliantly, actually, about Germany and about Bismarck's rule in Germany and how he had done what the bourgeoisie had failed to do. So there's an alternative. There aren't a set of tasks that have to be accomplished. What you actually have is the necessity of achieving an independent capital accumulation. And that doesn't require necessarily a bourgeoisie, which means that the revolutionary process isn't necessary either in the way in which Trotsky thought. So that provides, I mean, what all that really means, I think, is that loads of countries have actually got to the point where they're fully developed capitalist countries without revolution. South Korea. When was the Korean Revolution? When was the Danish Revolution? Or the Czech Revolution? stages of, which is currently I've been experiencing a revival, a very real revival of Trotskyism, actually, by the Lord, Egnan and Desai, and the global level program socialism, and a lot of people the law and some more things. But more importantly, I suppose, that's on the left, and that's where the minority it is the class stuff, but there's only one way to put it, democracy, capitalist economy, and that's the path of it. But Fukuyama in his book actually has a great image, it's quite appropriate actually. Even the supporting members of the Tudor was a wagon train, he says, the side walls of the wagon train, and the ones at the front, like America and Britain and so on, are way adopting or doing this, they're all going to get to the same point in the end. This is a classic stages notion where we're all going to get to the law and dodge at some point. Massacre the exterminated population. Extrapolate any further on the metaphor. There's a theme that's begun to revive, and against that, I think we have to propose a new and combined development. So a few things to identify. First, if you think ideological terms, there's a lot of identify it, right? Think of Al-Qaeda. It's not modern, only in the fact that it's a satellite phone platform website. There was demonstrates Al-Qaeda, understand? Saying, it's not about saying, well, Al-Qaeda are all barbaric, living in a cave, medieval, still have some Huntington, classical civilization, where in the Middle East before, somewhere in the Middle East, 100,000 young men, well-dressed and changed, thinking, combination of the is, I suppose, that modern radical Islam, that example, isn't some sort of ancient formation, some sort of medieval formation. It's actually a completely modern formation which couldn't have existed in the 18th, 19th century. A big form of nationalism, of growing. A few final points. I think the new government development is still a tool that have to be used to understand the world. And I think it's particularly the case if you look at China. I think China is a classic example of that, where you can see you have the kind of juxtaposition, which is peasant agriculture side by side with the wages of state, not Shanghai. And I think that's also true in Indonesia, India, and so on. It's absolutely necessary. It's a new thing which I have to encounter. And that's something that probably didn't exist to the same extent across these times. Zizek mentioned on Friday, which is an article by Mike Davis, which appeared in New of slum communities around all the major capitals of the world, perhaps people live in conditions which are indescribable